I just would like to start with a contemporary anecdote that I think nonetheless bears resonances to medieval burial practices. A wealthy oligarch living in London asks his wife, "Will you bury me in Harrods? So I know you will visit me every week." So that plea, even if humorous, touches upon a number of points that preoccupied medieval people. Death and the wish to be commemorated, the frequency of commemorating, as well as the significance of a burial location. These points will be addressed in relation to burials in Franciscan friaries, especially in Munster. In a medieval society, death and burial were tied to feudal structures, where land and family determined belonging. For the Irish noble and mercantile classes that founded and endowed Franciscan friaries, being buried in a local friary ensured prayers from a local priest, the family, and a local community. That close association between a locality and a burial place can be illustrated by a 17th century Franciscan Chalice from Kinallechan. The friary was endowed by the de Burgo family in the late 14th century. Despite the dissolution and the destruction of the friary, the de Burgos continued to protect the friars as exemplified by the chalice. The chalice was provided, as you can see from the inscription, by John de Burgo for the use of a chapel of his ancestors in the year 1676, when the guardian of the friary was Bonaventure de Burgo. The inscription on the chalice testifies that one of the chapels in the friary was designated as a family's mausoleum, where the de Burgo ancestors were prayed for by their descendants, and often by the friar priests from their own family. Other Irish friaries were similarly planned by their founders as burial sites. Donegal Friary, established by Red Hugh O'Donnell and his mother Nuala O'Connor, became a burial place for Hugo. As the annals of the Four Masters state, his wife, Fionnuala O'Brien, following his death, spent her life and her wealth in acts of charity and humanity, and was for 22 years in the habit of St. Francis, meaning she became a Franciscan tertiary, the member of the Third Franciscan Order. Fionnuala's sister, Margaret O'Brien, contributed together with her husband, Owen O'Rourke, to the establishment of Dromaher Friary. Both Margaret and her husband were buried there. Kilconnell Friary in County Galway, established by William O'Kelly, was then endowed by his son Malachy and continued to be associated with the O'Kellys. The Friary of Ennis, to which I will return throughout the paper, was founded by the O'Brien family in the mid to the late 13th century, and possibly from the onset was planned as the family's mausoleum. As the annals of Inishvallen state, under 1306, Torblach O'Brien, King of Thomond, a chaste, pious, and wise man, died and was buried in the church which he had built for the friars. According to the same annals, Diarmuid O'Brien, Chief of Thomond, died and was buried there in the habit of a friar's minor in 1313. The O'Briens continued to be buried in Ennis throughout the 14th century. In the late 15th century, a female member of the O'Brien family commissioned the tomb on which she is represented to be created in the choir of the friary. Other women buried in Ennis included Renalda O'Brien, who after an eventful life became an abbess of the Augustinian nunnery at Killown near Ennis. In her will of 1510, she requested to be buried in the church of a monastery of Ennis, preferring burial in the family's church to the burial in the neighboring nunnery. The most prestigious burial space within a friary was the choir of a church, especially the area beneath or around the high altar. So the late 15th century O'Brien MacMahon tomb in Ennis, it's the same tomb now that we are looking at, but a different shot, so you can see the tomb next to what would have been the high altar by the east window. So that late 15th century tomb in Ennis was located to the side of the high altar on the north wall of the choir, possibly replacing the 13th century tomb of the founder. A similar position to the left of the main altar was reserved for McNamara's in Quinn Friary. The founder of Kilcray, Cormac McCarthy, was buried in the choir of the friary as well. A list of medieval burials in Waterford Friary also indicates the prominence of the altar area, as well as the density of the burials in the choir. It reads that Hugo Purcell, knight, founder of the monastery of the Friars Minor, and that was in 1240, is buried at the left-hand side of the altar of the said monastery near the wall. A tomb of a judge was placed to the right of the altar. Other burials, as you can see from the slide, were located close to a vestibule, under the main altar, and underneath the steps leading to it, as well as around the chair that stood in the center of the choir, and close to the and on the sides of the choir as well. In total, 10 tombs, some of which enclosed multiple burials, were located in the choir. Overall, 58 tombs, some with multiple burials, were located in a friary that measured 130 feet in length. While the space of Waterford Friary seems crowded with burials, it is nothing in comparison with close to 780 names of those buried in the Franciscan Friary in London. That was more than twice the length of Waterford Friary. So the question needs to be asked, why were Franciscan friars and their friaries, particularly their choirs, such desired burial sites? Firstly, the friars provided a very efficient way of commemorating the dead that goes back to the early years of Franciscanism. Francis himself stipulated that friars should pray for the dead. His charisma, the zeal of the first Franciscans, and the support of the papacy resulted in the dramatic spread of the Franciscan order across Europe. Through their preaching and confessions, the friars appealed to all levels of society. Yet their involvement in local and international politics ensured their enduring association with ruling European dynasties. As early as the 13th century, the friars obtained the papal privilege to bury lay people in their friaries. The burial in a friary guaranteed the continuous commemoration of the deceased, as the friars were able to provide a wide variety of prayers and liturgical practices. For example, London friars offered memorial masses and anniversary masses, and they could deliver them in large quantities at a very short notice. Secondly, the friars' legislation required that they should pray for the souls of their benefactors. Observant or Reformed friars of the 15th century celebrated a weekly mass for their deceased benefactors. In addition, each friary had an obituary, and we're going to hear more about obituaries, or a list of the deceased, which was read out loud each year. Such lists shed a light on the connection between the friars and the local society. The surviving obituary from Galway, this is a translation, indicates the continuity of the de Burgo patronage of the friary. And as seen from the document, the founder of the friary, William de Burgo, would have been commemorated on the day of his death in February. The obituary from Adair, again this is a 19th century translation, provide a list of endowments that encompassed sections of the friary, and some of them are underlined there for you, and its furnishings. And that list is followed by the list of donors' death, with the exact day and year of their death. The only person whose burial site is mentioned specifically is Joanna of Oloin. The name and her burial are erroneously translated in this 19th century translation. So she was a widow of Fitzgibbon of Mahuna near Newcastle West, near Limerick, and she incorporated her tomb, according to the 17th century document, under the sedilia next to the main altar. So she must have been a woman of significant influence, given the location of her burial. Benefactors who were not buried in a Franciscan friary could still request prayers from the Franciscans, as was the case of a Cork merchant, John de Winchedon, who in his will requested to be buried in the Augustinian church there, but still bequeathed 3 marks to the Franciscans of Cork, where his son was a friar, and separately donated 3 marks to the same order for masses to be celebrated for the repose of his soul. Thirdly, some tombs would have had a liturgical usage. A highly desired burial location on the left-hand side of a high altar ultimately referred to the position of Christ's tomb in Jerusalem, information on which can be found in the insular sources as early as the 7th century, when Adamnan states in his description of the holy places that the sepulchre of the Lord is in the northern part of a domed structure. In Irish mendicant churches, as in England, the founder's tomb often doubled as the Easter sepulchre, utilizing a privileged burial space of the donor in the close proximity of a high altar. During the Easter liturgy, the tomb of the donor was transformed into the Lord's sepulchre as it housed the Eucharistic host that represented the body of Christ. The shape of many tombs located on the north side of the choir indicates that these tombs indeed served as Easter sepulchres. Such is the case with flat-shaped tops of Quin and Ennis tombs. A close study of the Ennis tomb clearly indicates that the representations of the Passion are not narrative, so they are not simple representations of a gospel story, but are liturgical in their meaning. So when we look at that tomb, the central image here is that of a crucifixion. And when we look at it close, you can see that next to Christ are angelic figures at the foot of the cross and at the ends of the cross shaft. What they are doing, they are collecting Christ's blood, and this is an allusion to the symbolic representation of the origins of the Eucharist. So this is not a narrative, this is a liturgical representation of Christ's crucifixion. Similarly, in the scene of the crucifixion, we see angels next to Christ's head with turbals. And this is again an allusion to liturgy and evokes the sensing of the Easter sepulchre on Easter morning. The choir with the founder's tomb, so again we are looking here at Ennis, was separated from the nave by a rood screen, which was not so much a barrier, but a structure that enabled the laity to access the choir by gazing at it, but also by physically moving into the sacred space. So what we have on the left is the image of Ennis, and on the right is how it would have looked if we had the rood screen. This is a lattice structure through which the laity can glimpse at what is going on at the main altar. But as has been argued by a lot of scholars recently, the spatial division was not so much a divide. It was the way for laity to enter into the sacred space. So in the case of continental churches, that strict spatial division has been questioned and argued against by a lot of scholars recently. And examples from Italian Franciscan churches indicated that lay benefactors, including women, were permitted in the choir, which is regarded as the sacred space. The elaborate nature of the Ennis tomb with a unique Passion cycle can only be explained if we consider that it was not made solely for the benefit of the friars, but also for the privileged members of the congregation, and maybe for the devotional benefits of the wider congregation. Another related reason for the choice of Franciscan friaries as burial sites, especially amongst the nobility, was the public display of their piety, as well as a close relationship between the friars and upper groups of a medieval society. The Greyfriars Church in London, that I referred to already, became a burial place for 3 queens, including Queen Margaret, the second wife of Edward I, while his first wife was buried in Westminster Abbey. The establishment of Irish friars as mausolea has precedents in other parts of Europe, where interesting comparative material for the study of politics and patronage can be found. For example, in Krakow in Poland, the Franciscan friary, founded in 1250s, was planned as a mausoleum from the start as part of the founder's aspiration to restore monarchy in Poland and create a burial place for the dynasty. The founder of the church, Bolesław, and his sister were buried in the friary, despite the fact that their father and grandfather were buried in Krakow Cathedral. So questions based on such comparative studies, and I think it is very crucial that we use examples from elsewhere to what is going on in Ireland, questions can be asked in relation to Irish burials. So why some O'Briens were buried in Limerick Cathedral and the Dominican Church, others in the Cistercian Abbey of Cork, and then the whole line of them in Ennis. A public display of one's piety and prestige is exemplified in the tomb of Roland Fitzeustace, the treasurer, and his third wife, Margaret Jennico. The cenotaph was erected in St. Odin's Church in Dublin, while the couple were buried at Kilcullen Friary that Roland had founded. fragments of tomb sculpture, possibly from different tombs, are now set into a single frieze. So you can see them here in front of that slide, and the tomb is behind now, kind of the position is changed because of the bad weather conditions, so it is now under this kind of arch protected. So one section of a frieze, so I'm going to zoom on that frieze that is in the foreground, clearly constitutes a unit made of a roundel with the family's coats of arms, the instruments of the Passion, and the figure of Francis. The instruments of the Passion to the left telescope the whole of the Passion story into discrete signs. By looking at them, a devotee was reminded of sacred events. They were mental images which would have been shaped in one's mind through liturgy, prayer, and visual imagery. So how they functioned is a little bit like icons on a computer. So you click, you look at one image, for example, the column, and the whole narrative would open up. So these are points that evoke a story. These are iconic images that open a door into a narrative. The pairing of a secular coat of arms with the arms of Christ's Passion presents an interesting iconographic dialogue on patronage and piety. Placed between them is St. Francis, with the right hand raised in preaching and his left hand pointing towards his side wound. The association between Francis's stigmata and the wounds of Christ formed the very center of Franciscan spirituality. Early representations of Francis in biographies, sermons, papal bulls, as well as images, promoted him as the other Christ, while his wounds were seen as a new type of a miracle that was particularly powerful as a medium in intercession for both the living and the dead. In an Irish context, that can be seen in the will of John Fitzhenry Blake, who requested to be buried in the Franciscan Friary in Galway, quote, under the protection of Francis and with the suffrages of the Franciscans. And the Franciscan late 15th century poet, Philip Bocht O'Higgin, speaks of Francis's wounds, especially that in his side, as having a special power to avenge the wounds of Christ. As Christ's wounds, Francis's stigmata were viewed as the instruments of salvation and forgiveness. In Ennis Friary, as in Kilcullen, the instruments of the Passion displayed around the figure of a man of sorrows, so you see that wonderful pairing in Ennis. For anybody who would enter the friary, the first images that you would see are St. Francis, and then the image of a man of sorrows surrounded with the Passion instruments. And these are in front of the root screen that forms a backdrop to the two images. So this is, if we are thinking in terms of liturgical drama, this would have been quite dramatic. Francis is here presented not only as the other Christ, but also as the intercessor, opening his side wound, so again it's this emphasis on his side wound, and as a living stone of the church. The idea supported by the very medium of stone used to present the image of a saint, and by textual comparisons of a saint, again, quote, he is a stone ready to be fitted into the heavenly Jerusalem. So that idea of a stone is probably evoked here. Around the period when Ennis sculptures were executed, the friary had a noted preacher and confessor named Friar Fergal O'Treen. His confession of a chieftain, Conor O'Brien, who died in 1496, was recorded in the early 17th century. As part of his spiritual strategy, Friar Fergal took upon himself all the sins of the O'Brien and gave him all the merits he had gained throughout his holy life. That spiritual barter, officiated by a Franciscan friar, saved the O'Brien, described as warlike and wicked, from eternal damnation. So just to finish off, I think the key reason for the selection of Franciscan friaries as burial sites by many is Francis himself, the founder of the order of noted preachers and confessors, whose stigmata that was so successfully promoted by the order and by the papacy were seen as making him particularly close to Christ and particularly helpful as the intercessor. Okay, thank you.